You think 'cause your daddy mops my floors, you understand strategy, boy? That sentence, spat like spit on marble, wasn't just insult. It was a hammer. A hammer that struck Elliot Ray's memory so deep, it rang like a cold bell. That night, a 6-year-old janitor's son walked out of the service elevator and sat at a chessboard no one thought he deserved to touch, and cracked open a billionaire's certainty like an egg. The Blackwell Tower on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan never slept. Even after the floors dimmed and the elevators slowed, its glass skin still glowed like an overworked eye. Inside elevator number 3, surrounded by cleaning chemicals and rust-stained mops, stood Elliot Ray. He was 6 years old, pale as milk, with soft blonde hair that curled near the temples. He wore a janitor's uniform too long for his arms and a pair of boots one size too large. His hands clutched a cracked plastic trash bin, and beside him stood Frank Ray, his father, silent and bent from 2 jobs and 1 great loss. Frank worked the night shift cleaning Blackwell Tower and patched pipes during the day for a contractor who never remembered his name. His wife, Elliot's mother, had died of ovarian cancer 2 winters ago. Insurance didn't cover the last hospital stay, or the casket, or the absence. And so they had ended up here, in a basement apartment so damp mushrooms grew behind the toilet. Frank cleaned. Elliot watched. And between the quiet gaps of work and grief, something else had begun to grow. Chess. Most people assumed Elliot was quiet because he was shy. In truth, he was listening. Listening in a way few adults ever did. Eyes scanning, ears open like saucers, heart attuned to small, invisible rhythms. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was often a question that made people pause. His mind, sharp like lake ice in February, could hold entire board positions after seeing them once. He didn't memorize. He understood. Every piece was a feeling, every square a mood. Bishop's long diagonals felt like corridors in a hospital. The knight's L-shaped leaps reminded him of his father coming home late. Not direct, not quick, but always arriving. Every night after Frank mopped the 68th floor, they'd descend back to the lobby and pass by the booth of Joseph Klein, the mute doorman. Once, Mr. Klein had been a rising chess star in Austria, known for his intuitive mid-game traps. A stroke had taken his speech and much of his balance, but not his memory, and certainly not his chess. It was Joseph who placed a magnetic board behind his booth and began playing with Elliot by pointing. First, simple mates. Then, endgames. Then, entire matches from 1987's Vienna Open. No words passed between them, only pawns, pieces, and silent nods. And Elliot learned. That night, the night that would later be remembered in headlines and investor meetings, began like many others. Frank and Elliot rode the elevator to the 78th floor, the executive conference level. Frank had to clean after a late board meeting. He told Elliot to stay quiet, not to touch anything. "Just wait by the wall," he whispered, ruffling Elliot's hair. But Elliot's eyes had already found something, a chessboard. It wasn't just any board. The squares were obsidian and ivory. The base was walnut, hand-carved with silver trim along the edges. The board sat atop a low coffee table in the center of the penthouse lounge, the kind of table made for cigars and brandy, not children's hands. But the pieces were mid-game. Someone had left them that way. And to Elliot, they were screaming. He moved closer. His boots made no sound on the Persian rug. The white king had already castled. Black's bishop was pinned. A rook stood isolated on e5. The whole formation, it looked eerily familiar. From where? Then he saw it. Rubinstein versus Salway, Wuj, 1908. A trap disguised as symmetry. He whispered to himself, "Bishop, to b6. Behind him, a voice thundered. You think 'cause your daddy mops my floors, you understand strategy, boy? Elliot froze. Turning slowly, he saw the speaker. A tall man with silvering hair and a navy suit, the kind that cost more than a year's rent. His tie had a golden pin shaped like a bull, Wall Street's mascot. His wristwatch ticked louder than some cars. This was Hunter Blackwell, founder of Blackwell & Company, billionaire investor, and currently host of 3 visiting hedge fund managers from Japan and Switzerland. They had been analyzing the chessboard, sipping scotch, when Elliot had made his move. "I apologize," Frank stammered, grabbing his son's arm. "He didn't mean to—" But Blackwell raised a hand. No. Let's see something." He knelt beside the board. "You said bishop to B6, kid?" Elliot nodded. Blackwell moved the piece. The Swiss man inhaled sharply. The Japanese delegate set down his drink. "That isolates my knight," Blackwell muttered. "Rook's trapped." "Checkmate in 6, Elliot said, voice almost inaudible. The room stilled. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "You little punk! You studied this opening?" Elliot shrugged. "It's a Rubinstein echo. But your variation was off-tempo." The Swiss man laughed. "He's right. This boy knows his lines." What happened next would become the subject of 100 blogs and 2 Netflix documentaries. Blackwell challenged Elliot to a game, in front of investors, on the $1 million board. With the night janitor watching from the corner, mop still dripping. Blackwell lost in 23 moves. He demanded a rematch. Lost again. In 19. By the 3rd game, Elliot played for a draw, deliberately, and said at the end, "Not every game is about winning. Some are about understanding the board." Blackwell sat back, stunned, and said nothing for a long time. That night, Frank didn't get scolded. He got a handshake. Joseph Klein got a thank you note and a leather chess set. And Elliot got an invitation. Not to play again, not yet, but to teach. Blackwell, once a man who believed children should be seen and not heard, had been seen and heard and changed. But the board wasn't finished with them yet. This was only the first move. By the time the first pale light touched the glass ribs of Blackwell Tower, 3 currents had already begun to flow through the city. Whispers traveled across continents about a boy no taller than the table he had conquered. A junior partner, reckless with ambition, had leaked grainy footage of the matches to an investor chat group. And Joseph Klein, the mute doorman, had opened his booth door to find an envelope. A note in Hunter Blackwell's precise hand, and a check that could have carried him through many winters. Elliot, however, woke in the basement apartment with no knowledge of these ripples. He sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, a magnetic chessboard balanced on his knees. The small plastic pieces clicked as he replayed each move of the night before. For him, the board was not mere memory. It was a pulse, steady and alive. Frank Ray, his father, leaned against the rust-flecked sink. His eyes were lined with sleeplessness. He had seen too much of life to be surprised by cruelty, but this was something different. His son, 6 years old, tender as first snow, had struck down a man who held half of Wall Street in his palm. Pride swelled inside him, but so did fear. Pride made him stand taller. Fear made his hands tremble as he rinsed a chipped coffee cup over and over. "You can't go back up there, Elliot," Frank said at last, his voice low and unsteady. "Not like that. Not again." The boy looked up, pale hair falling into his eyes. "Why not?" Frank had no answer fit for a child. He turned on the tap, and the water moaned as it spilled from tired pipes. The truth, that power rarely forgave humiliation, especially from the powerless, lay heavy in his chest. But Elliot only saw his father's silence, as another puzzle to be solved. High above, on the 78th floor, Hunter Blackwell also greeted the dawn without sleep. He stood before the window, Central Park stretched at his feet like a green chessboard, every path a file, every lamppost a pawn. His reflection floated over the glass, a man whose hair had begun to silver, whose eyes were too sharp to soften, whose fortune was measured not in millions, but in empires. Yet what he saw most clearly was the child, Elliot, whose small hand had toppled his king not once, but twice. Blackwell had built his life upon the myth of foresight. 10 moves ahead, his colleagues said. A man who bent markets like reeds, who made rivals appear clumsy, who never lost. And then came a janitor's son, with eyes that saw beyond marble and mahogany, and with a knight's leap had undone him before his own board of admirers. He had not merely been beaten. He had been revealed. "Bring him back," Blackwell murmured to his assistant. "Sir?" "The boy, Elliot Ray. I want another game." The assistant hesitated. "But the press—" "I said bring him." The tone was soft, but the steel beneath it could break stone. That evening, Elliot tapped on the glass of Joseph Klein's booth. The old man opened the narrow door. His frame was bent, his speech silenced long ago, but his eyes carried the sharpness of a rook controlling an open file. He gestured to the stool beside him, where a portable chessboard already waited. Elliot climbed up. For the first time since Joseph had known him, the boy's composure trembled. "Mr. Blackwell asked me to play again," Elliot whispered. Joseph raised one gray brow. "But not in secret. He wants people there. Cameras. Lights. He wants it to be a show." Joseph frowned. He pushed a bishop forward on the board, leaving it exposed, sacrificed. Elliot studied the move, puzzled. Then his eyes widened with understanding. Some pieces, Joseph was saying, must be risked for the sake of greater truth. The boy nodded slowly. "All right." 3 days later, the tower's boardroom was transformed. The long table where mergers had been sealed and fortunes traded was gone, replaced by a raised dais at the center of the marble floor. Upon it stood the same board, ivory and ebony, silver trim gleaming beneath hot lights. Around it gathered men in dark suits, women with notebooks, cameras humming like restless bees. They called it the Marble Match. Frank stood in the doorway, shoulders stiff, his janitor's uniform freshly washed but still carrying the smell of bleach. He watched his son cross the polished floor, his boots too large, his shirt cuffs too long. Yet Elliot carried himself with a gravity that made even the investors shift uneasily. Blackwell entered with the calm smile of a man rehearsed for spectacle. But his eyes betrayed him. They glittered with the hunger of someone who had tasted defeat and could not abide its flavor. The arbiter, a retired grandmaster summoned for legitimacy, adjusted the clock. "Gentlemen," he intoned, "begin." Elliot pushed forward his king's pawn. 1. E4. Blackwell answered sharply. C5, the Sicilian defense, a weapon for those who preferred storms to sunlight, who sought imbalance and blood. It was the opening of warriors, not poets. Elliot replied not with a child's timidity, but with the Alpine variation. 2. C3, a quieter path, building structure before fury. Joseph had taught him that patience could strangle ambition, that sometimes a whisper could silence a shout. The room leaned forward. Pieces developed. Pawns locked. Knights tangled. By the 17th move, tension had wound the board like a drawn bowstring. And then, the rook sacrifice. Gasps broke the silence. Elliot lifted his rook with steady hand and placed it in Blackwell's path. a gift too generous to refuse. Blackwell pounced, capturing it. 4 moves later, realization spread across his face like dawn across glass towers. The sacrifice had been a net. Elliot had seen 11 moves ahead. The knight, humble on F3, sprang to life, threading patterns invisible until too late. Check. Check again. And then the soft finality of checkmate. Silence claimed the room. Blackwell leaned back. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might erupt. But then something inside him gave way. His smile, when it came, was unpolished, almost human. "Son," he said, his voice hushed but steady, "you just reminded me of something I had forgotten." That night, outside the tower, a black car idled at the curb. Its windows reflected the neon of the city, harsh yet fragile. Frank held Elliot's hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes betrayed both pride and ache. "You're 6 years old, Elliot," he murmured. "Most boys your age are still learning to tie their shoes." Elliot grinned softly. "That's why I like Velcro." For the first time in years, Frank laughed without bitterness. The sound startled even him, as if it had been locked away in some hidden attic of his heart. The car pulled away, carrying them into the night grid of Manhattan. A boy who saw streets like ranks and files, a father who walked beside him in quiet awe, and an unseen destiny waiting like a queen behind a veil of pawns. The city did not rest after the marble match. Newspapers printed Elliot's name in cautious fonts. Investors whispered his moves over bourbon. And children, in apartments where toys were scarce, began scratching chessboards onto cardboard with pencils, imagining themselves the pale-haired boy who had stared down a titan. But for Elliot, the morning after was not fame. It was silence. He sat on the edge of his mattress, feet dangling above cold concrete, studying the knight he held in his hand. Small, plastic, scarred from years of play. Yet to him it was more than a piece. It was a reminder of Joseph's teaching. The knight moves in crooked lines, Elliot, but it always arrives. Sometimes the straight path is not the truest. Frank brewed weak coffee at the stove. His eyes were tired, but restless. "People will come," he said softly. "Reporters, strangers. They'll want pictures, words, maybe promises. You're just a boy. You don't owe them any of that." Elliot nodded, though his thoughts were already far away, dancing through patterns only he could see. By mid-afternoon, the knock came. It wasn't a reporter. It was Hunter Blackwell himself. No cameras, no entourage. Just a man in a long coat, his shadow filling the narrow doorway of the basement flat. Frank stiffened. "What do you want?" Blackwell removed his hat. His hair, silver at the temples, caught the light. He looked less like a conqueror than a man who had finally heard the word no and carried it in his chest like a stone. "I came to apologize," he said simply, "and to ask permission." Frank's guard did not drop. "Permission for what?" Blackwell's eyes softened. "To give your son what I can never give mine." The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the pipes groan above them. Finally, Elliot stepped forward, clutching the knight in his small hand. His voice was steady. "Permission isn't mine, it's the board's. If you want to play, you must sit and move." Blackwell exhaled, almost a laugh. "Then perhaps you'll allow me to sit." 2 nights later, the boardroom was filled again, but this time, it was not investors or cameras. It was something quieter, almost fragile. Blackwell had invited 3 children from the company's janitorial staff, each no older than 10. Their parents stood uncertain at the edges of the marble floor. At the center, Elliot waited, small and serious, as if the silver-trimmed board had become his rightful ground. The game was not between him and Blackwell. It was between Elliot and a boy named Samuel, the son of a cleaner from Queens. Samuel's hands trembled as he touched the pawns, unsure, hesitant. "Take your time," Elliot said gently. "It's not about moving fast. It's about seeing." Samuel nodded, and the game began. Each move unfolded slowly, like a song sung by children who did not yet know all the words, but carried the tune with pure intent. Elliot guided without condescension, pointing softly, explaining patterns with the patience of someone much older than 6. When Samuel stumbled into a trap, Elliot paused. "See? Your knight is trapped because he wanted to be brave too quickly. Sometimes the knight must wait in the shadows. That's its strength." The boy listened, eyes wide, and tried again. At the end, Elliot did not win. He let the game dissolve into a stalemate, smiling as Samuel grinned with relief. The parents wiped their eyes. Frank, standing apart, felt his chest swell with a pride that was almost painful. And Blackwell watched, unmoving, as if every captured pawn was chiseling away at the stone around his own heart. But light always draws shadow. The marble match had made Elliot a curiosity, and curiosity soon attracted claws. By the next morning, tabloids splashed headlines across their covers. "Janitor's son humiliates Wall Street legend. Prodigy or puppet? Who is Elliot Ray?" Photographers gathered outside the tower. Strangers called the basement apartment phone, demanding interviews. Some offers were polite, others smelled of exploitation. Sponsorships, contracts, promises too polished to be trusted. Frank tried to shield his son, but the world was already pressing in. "You don't have to play anymore," Frank told Elliot one night, kneeling to meet his eyes. "We can leave. Go back to Pennsylvania. No one there cares about towers or kings." Elliot shook his head slowly. "The game isn't finished yet." Frank swallowed hard. "It's not just a game, Elliot. These people, they'll use you. They'll take what they want and leave you with nothing." The boy looked at his father with that quiet gaze that so often unsettled adults. "They can't take what's inside my head, Dad, unless I give it." It was Joseph who reminded Elliot of the cost. One evening, as they played in the booth, Joseph pushed a knight forward into danger. Elliot frowned. "That's reckless." Joseph tapped the board twice, then pointed to his chest. "Sacrifice." Elliot understood. The knight, beloved and strange in its crooked movement, sometimes had to fall so the board could open for something greater. He held the small plastic knight from his magnetic set, the one he had carried like a talisman since the night of the marble match. For the first time, he wondered if his own life was beginning to resemble that piece, moving oddly, drawing attention, and perhaps destined to be given up for something larger than himself. The true test came a week later. Blackwell had arranged a public exhibition, not for profit, but to silence the noise. He invited journalists, but no investors, children, but no financiers. When Elliot entered the hall, he found not one board, but 10, arranged in a circle. At each sat a child, sons and daughters of janitors, clerks, drivers. Their eyes flickered with both fear and awe. "You will play them all," Blackwell said quietly. "At once." Frank started to object, but Elliot touched his father's hand. "It's all right." And so it began. The boy walked the circle slowly, each move deliberate. His mind, bright as morning light, held every position, every possibility. He bent down to explain quietly to each child, not rushing them, never scolding, only guiding. Some games ended quickly, others stretched long into the evening. By the final board, Elliot was pale with fatigue but still smiling. He offered the last opponent, a shy girl named Rosa, a draw. She accepted, her small face glowing with victory she could keep in her heart forever. The crowd applauded softly, not with the roar of spectacle, but with the reverence of a prayer. That night, when they returned to the basement flat, Frank tucked Elliot into bed and lingered at his side. "You gave up wins tonight," he said. Elliot yawned. "The knight can't always survive, Dad. But sometimes, by falling, it saves the king." Frank kissed his son's forehead, tears burning behind his tired eyes. In the silence that followed, the city hummed above them, restless and unknowing. But in that small room, a truth had been planted. That brilliance was not just in conquering, but in teaching, in giving, in sacrifice. And Elliot Ray, 6 years old, janitor's son, already carried the wisdom of a knight who knew his path might be short, but never meaningless. In chess, a pawn is the smallest of pieces, humble, expendable, rarely remembered. Yet when pressed forward, step by step, it can change the shape of the whole board. It was this lesson that now unfolded not on 64 squares, but in the lives of the Rays. The weeks after the marble match did not belong to silence. Reporters crowded the lobby of Blackwell Tower, waiting for a glimpse of the boy prodigy. Headlines multiplied like ivy across the walls of newsstands. "The janitor's child who shook Wall Street." "6-year-old genius or media mirage." "Chess prodigy from basement to boardroom." Photographers followed Frank on his night shifts, snapping pictures of his mop and bucket as though they were relics. Elliot, once invisible, had become a figure woven into gossip, envy, and fascination. But in the basement apartment, life was no softer. The pipes still groaned. The walls still wept with damp. Frank still returned from work with bleach on his hands. Only now the air carried another weight: expectation. One evening, a man in a polished suit knocked at their door. He introduced himself as a representative of a sports agency. "We can build a future for your son," he said smoothly. "Television appearances, book deals, sponsorships. Imagine a scholarship fund in his name. We can make him the youngest millionaire in America." Frank's jaw tightened. "He's 6. The man smiled with the pity of someone who thought himself wiser. "Exactly. That's the point. Youth sells. Innocence sells. Let us do the work. You just sign." Elliot, sitting quietly at the table, lifted his eyes. "I'm not for sale." The words were simple, almost whispered, but they struck the man like a slap. His smile faltered. He gathered his papers and left, muttering about wasted opportunity. When the door shut, Frank sat heavily in the chair across from his son. "You shouldn't have to say that," he murmured. "You shouldn't have to know those words yet." Elliot touched the knight he carried in his pocket. "But I do." Joseph Klein remained Elliot's refuge. Each evening, in the quiet of the lobby booth, they played. No cameras, no investors, only the steady click of wooden pieces and Joseph's watchful eyes. One night, Joseph moved a pawn forward, pressing it into enemy territory, exposed and fragile. Elliot tilted his head. "Why risk it?" Joseph pointed to the board with a trembling finger, then slowly curled his hand into a fist. Pressure. Elliot understood. A pawn pressed forward may be weak, but it forces the board to respond. It demands attention. Sometimes, by advancing one small step, the pawn shifts the balance of everything. That night, as he lay in bed, Elliot realized he was becoming that pawn. Each step forward, each game, each headline, pressed not only himself, but his father, into a world they had never chosen. The true pressure came in the form of an invitation. The National Chess Federation, stirred by the publicity, announced an exhibition to be held at Columbia University. Grandmasters would attend. Media would broadcast. And at the center of the stage, They wanted Elliot Ray. Frank hesitated, letter in hand. This isn't just Blackwell anymore. This is the whole country watching. Elliot's eyes shone with a quiet fire. It's a board, Dad, just a bigger one. Frank shook his head. No, Elliot, it's not just a board. It's men with money, with power, with cameras that never turn off. If you go, you won't be able to come back to being just my boy. The silence that followed was heavier than argument. Finally, Elliot spoke softly. A pawn doesn't stay a pawn forever. The day of the exhibition, Columbia's Grand Hall glowed with chandeliers. The marble floor, polished like ice, reflected the lights. Rows of chairs filled with scholars, journalists, and students who whispered excitedly about the boy genius. Elliot entered holding Frank's hand. His shirt was ironed, though still a size too large. His face was calm, but his eyes darted like pieces, scanning the board. The exhibition was not a duel, but a gauntlet. 10 grandmasters seated in a line, each waiting to test the child. Cameras hovered. Reporters scribbled. When the arbiter gave the signal, Elliot walked from board to board, touching pieces with delicate certainty. His small frame moved like a pendulum, his mind carrying 10 games at once. The audience marveled. Some games ended quickly, others stretched long. Against one grandmaster, Elliot sacrificed a bishop, drawing murmurs of doubt. But 6 moves later, he turned the trap inside out, forcing resignation. By the end of the evening, Elliot had won 7 games, drawn 2, and lost only 1, to a veteran who clasped his hand afterward and whispered, "You'll surpass us all." The hall erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters rushed forward. But Elliot only looked to Frank. His father's eyes glistened, both with pride and with the weight of what had been set in motion. That night, back in the basement flat, Frank tucked Elliot into bed. The boy was tired, but his eyes still glowed with patterns unseen. "You moved like you belonged there," Frank whispered. Elliot smiled faintly. "A pawn belongs on the board, Dad, even when it feels small." Frank sat beside him in silence, hearing the distant hum of the city above. He thought of his late wife, of her laughter, of the life she had imagined for them. He wondered if she could see their son now, pressing forward, step by step, into a world far larger than the small, damp room they called home. And as Elliot drifted into sleep, Frank realized that the boy was no longer just his son. He was a pressed pawn, fragile, exposed, but moving toward the far side of the board where destinies transform. In chess, a gambit begins with sacrifice, a pawn pushed forward, a piece abandoned, an invitation for imbalance. But there are gambits beyond the board, sacrifices of trust, of innocence, of truth itself. For Elliot Ray, only 6 years old, the next gambit would not be measured in pieces, but in silence. The glow of Columbia had barely faded before shadows began to gather. Newspapers printed his face, his slight frame dwarfed by grandmasters, his eyes shining with unearthly calm. Commentators called him the child of the century. But behind the applause, murmurs spread. Could a janitor's son truly be so brilliant? Had the games been staged for spectacle? Was there perhaps a hidden hand guiding his moves? One columnist wrote with acid, "Genius or puppet? A child prodigy may charm the cameras, but one wonders how much of the game is his, and how much is rehearsed by unseen coaches." Frank read the words at dawn while Elliot still slept, his heart tightening. He crumpled the paper, but the ink had already seeped into him, poisoning pride with fear. At Blackwell Tower, the whispers grew sharper. The marble lobby that once rang with applause now echoed with suspicion. Some employees bowed their heads with respect. Others smirked as if sharing a joke too crude to voice. One night, as Frank mopped the gleaming floor, two executives passed by. They didn't lower their voices. "It's publicity, that's all," one said. "The janitor's kid plays a few memorized lines, the press eats it up." "Blackwell loves the story," the other replied. "Makes him look magnanimous. But real genius? Don't be ridiculous." Frank's mop stilled, his knuckles whitening around the handle. He wanted to shout, to demand respect for his son's mind, but he said nothing. Silence was safer. Elliot, though shielded, sensed the shift. In the lobby, strangers approached him not with warmth but with challenges. Men in suits leaned down, pushing positions across portable boards. "Solve this puzzle," they demanded. "Prove it wasn't luck." Sometimes he answered with quiet brilliance, forcing their kings into corners in mere minutes. Sometimes he simply walked away, his small shoulders tense. One evening, Joseph Klein placed a position on the board, a seemingly lost endgame. Elliot studied it silently for 10 minutes, then shook his head. "It can't be won," he said. Joseph's eyes glimmered. Slowly, he extended his hand across the board. "You see," he whispered, "there is no need to prove what already is." Elliot frowned. "But they want me to." Joseph squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Let them want. You are not their pawn." But silence has its cost. At school, classmates who once looked at Elliot with awe began to taunt. "Show us, genius," they jeered during recess. "Bet you can't beat us blindfolded." One boy knocked the pieces from Elliot's small travel board, scattering pawns into the dirt. Elliot bent to gather them, his face blank, but inside a storm brewed. That evening, Frank found his son staring at the cracked plastic pawn, the one missing its base. "Why don't you tell them to stop?" Frank asked gently. Elliot looked up, his eyes older than his years. "Because then I would be playing their game, not mine." Frank knelt, pulling his son close. He wanted to promise safety, to shield him from cruelty, but he knew no promise could protect a child marked by brilliance. The true test came weeks later when an invitation arrived for a private match, not in a hall of learning, but in the penthouse of a hedge fund magnate named Aldridge. "Exclusive audience," the letter said. "A chance to prove your genius before those who truly matter." Frank hesitated. Joseph warned against it, but the pressure was relentless. If they refused, whispers of fraud would deepen. If they accepted, the risk was unknown. And so, one winter evening, they ascended a glass tower higher than any they had known. The penthouse gleamed with wealth, crystal chandeliers, carpets thick as moss, windows opening to the trembling lights of Manhattan. A single board stood at the center. Elliot sat across from Aldridge, a man with cold eyes and hands heavy with rings. Around them, men and women in tailored suits leaned forward, champagne in hand, eager to watch the spectacle. The game began. Aldridge played not for beauty, but for cruelty. He slammed his pieces, smirked at Elliot's hesitations, muttered taunts under his breath. "Too slow, boy. Did Daddy whisper the move to you?" Elliot's small fingers trembled, but the fire in his eyes did not dim. He played quietly, patiently, absorbing pressure, waiting. By move 30, Aldridge launched a vicious attack, queenside pawns storming forward. The audience murmured approval, but Elliot's silence was his gambit. He had allowed the storm to overreach. One night sacrifice, a piece offered like a gift, shattered Aldridge's position. Suddenly his king was trapped, his pawns useless. Elliot's rook slid across the board with the inevitability of fate. "Checkmate," Elliot whispered. The room fell silent. Aldridge's face flushed crimson, then pale. He stood abruptly, scattering pieces across the carpet. "A trick," he spat. A rehearsed trick. No one moved. The champagne glasses trembled in hands. Frank stepped forward, voice steady though his chest thundered. No trick, just truth. He took Elliot's hand and together they walked out, leaving the glittering room behind. That night, in the basement, Elliot lay awake long after midnight. Dad, he whispered, why do they hate me for winning? Frank smoothed his son's hair, searching for words. Because, son, silence frightens people. When you speak with your moves, they can't argue back, so they try to make noise, to drown it out. Elliot closed his eyes. Then I'll keep playing, until they have nothing left to say. Frank kissed his forehead, though tears blurred his vision. For he knew this vow would cost his son dearly. A gambit begins with sacrifice. Elliot's silence had been his gambit. He had given up the comfort of invisibility, the shield of childhood, the ease of being ordinary. In return, he had gained not applause, but pressure. Yet within that pressure, like a pawn pressed forward, lay the possibility of transformation. And though the world muttered, doubted, envied, Elliot Ray's silence spoke louder than their noise. In chess, there is no sound more merciless than the ticking of the clock. It marks each passing second, not as rhythm, but as judgment. For a child of 6, whose fingers still trembled as they reached for carved wood, the clock was both enemy and teacher. And for Elliot Ray, time itself was about to cast its shadow across every board he touched. The invitation came not from a penthouse or a tower, but from an old church on the Upper West Side. Its basement had been converted into a modest chess hall, folding chairs, battered clocks, mismatched boards with squares faded from years of play. But the event was anything but modest, a simultaneous exhibition where dozens of players would face one challenger. The challenger was not Elliot. It was Grandmaster Victor Karpinski, a Polish émigré whose reputation stretched back to Cold War days. His eyes were gray as ash, his posture stiff with age, yet his presence filled the room with unspoken authority. He was a relic of another era, when chess was survival, when every move was sharpened by politics and pride. Elliot and Frank had not come to play. They had come to watch. Joseph Klein had whispered it would be worth seeing. A master shows not only moves, but the weight of time itself. But as the crowd settled, Karpinski's eyes fell on the small boy standing quietly by the wall. "The prodigy," he said in a thick accent. "Let him sit." A murmur ran through the room. Elliot's cheeks flushed. He looked to his father. Frank's brow furrowed. "You don't have to," he whispered. But Elliot, with the quiet certainty that had already become his armor, nodded. "I want to." And so he took his place at one of the many boards, his feet barely reaching the floor, his eyes level with the pieces. The simul began. Karpinski moved with the rhythm of habit, circling the room, making his opening moves swiftly. At each board, pawns advanced, knights leapt, bishops fanned out like wings. Elliot answered with simple development. The queen's gambit declined, a solid defense, classical, cautious. But then came the clock. Each board had one, ticking relentlessly. In a simul, the master holds the advantage of pace. He moves quickly, while opponents must decide in mere seconds, lest they fall behind. Elliot felt the pressure instantly. The ticking filled his ears, louder than whispers, louder than his own heartbeat. The pieces blurred. 10 seconds. Choose. He pushed a pawn. Safe. Too safe. He knew it as soon as his hand left the piece. Karpinski's lips curved faintly. Not mockery. Recognition. He had seen this before. Young talents strangled by time. By move 15, Elliot's position was cramped. His pawns huddled like frightened children, his rooks still caged. Karpinski's pieces flowed freely, pressing, probing. The onlookers leaned forward, some whispering, some smirking. The prodigy meets reality. Elliot's throat tightened. He wanted to freeze the clock, to think, to breathe. But the seconds drained without mercy. Then Joseph's voice echoed in his memory. When you cannot see far, see near. When time runs short, trust the simplest truth. He looked again. The knight on f3, the bishop on d3, his queen lurking behind. A pattern flickered, the skeleton of an old trap Joseph had once shown him. Elliot moved swiftly, almost recklessly. Knight to g5. A child's leap into danger. Gasps rippled through the room. Was he blundering? Karpinski halted. His gray eyes narrowed. He studied the board. For a moment, the silence thickened. Then, slowly, he nodded. The move was sound. Bold. The game stretched on. Elliot's pieces, once huddled, sprang into life. But the clock was still against him. With each hesitation, precious seconds melted away. His small hand fumbled to press the button, his legs dangling from the chair. Move 30. His position equal. The audience now hushed, sensing something beyond novelty. A child had held the line against a grandmaster. But Elliot's time showed less than 2 minutes. Karpinski had 20. It was not the board that would decide the game. It was the clock's shadow. At move 35, Elliot's head drooped. His breaths came shallow, his lips pale. Frank rose, alarmed, but Joseph placed a hand on his arm. "Wait," he whispered. "The boy must meet the shadow himself." The final sequence began. Karpinski pressed with machine-like precision, exploiting every second. Elliot defended desperately, hands trembling, eyes wide. He found good moves, even brilliant ones, but the clock devoured them. 10 seconds. 5. 1. The flag fell. Elliot's game was lost, not by checkmate, not by blunder, but by time. The room exhaled, some with relief, others with smug satisfaction. "Prodigy or not," one man muttered, "you can't beat the clock." But Karpinski raised his hand. Silence fell. He looked at Elliot, then at the audience. His voice, though cracked with age, rang clear. "This boy played like a master. Only the clock defeated him. And remember this, time is not an enemy. It is the final teacher. If he learns its lesson, none of you will stand against him." He reached across the board, extending his hand to Elliot. "Well played, young Ray." Elliot placed his tiny hand in the old master's. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Not despair, but resolve. That night, back in their small apartment, Frank tucked his son into bed. Elliot clutched his travel clock, the red flag still trembling inside its plastic casing. "Dad," he whispered, "I hate the clock." Frank sat beside him. "It's only a tool, son. It doesn't hate you back." "But it steals my time." Frank kissed his forehead. "Then you'll learn to steal it back." Elliot closed his eyes, the tick of the clock echoing in his dreams. He saw positions flashing, knights leaping, queens sacrificed, rooks slicing open defenses, all within the cruel countdown of seconds. When he woke before dawn, he set the clock, placed the pieces, and began again. Time had marked him now. He had lost not on the board, but against the shadow that ruled them all. Yet within that loss lay a deeper victory, the seed of patience, the hunger for discipline, the vow to master not only pieces, but minutes, hours, the rhythm of a lifetime. The boy who had beaten titans with brilliance would now learn endurance. And in the quiet of their basement home, as the clock ticked endlessly on, Elliot Ray began to grow into the player and the soul he was destined to become. There comes a moment in every great match when the board trembles, not from the movement of pieces, but from the weight of all that has led to it. A breaking point where silence can shatter and even the strongest heart may falter. For 6-year-old Elliot Ray, that breaking point arrived not in the quiet of a chess hall, but in the storm of a world determined to claim him. The weeks after the Samuel loss to Grandmaster Karpinski were restless ones. Elliot had gained something rarer than victory: respect. The Grandmaster's words, "Only the clock defeated him," spread like wildfire. Some called it generous, others called it prophecy. But for Elliot, it was a brand burned onto his young soul. He would not lose to time again. Yet with every headline came pressure. Television crews knocked at their apartment door. Strangers left letters addressed to the Bronx Prodigy. Offers came, sponsorships, interviews, contracts promising travel and wealth. Frank refused them all. "He is a boy," he repeated, again and again. "Not a commodity." But saying no to the world is like holding back the tide. It seeps in through cracks, rises through the floorboards. At school, Elliot could no longer fade into the background. Teachers treated him with awe or suspicion. Classmates wavered between envy and cruelty. One afternoon, as he quietly sketched a chess position in the corner of his notebook, a boy snatched the paper away. "You think you're better than us," the boy sneered. "You think you're smarter just because you play a stupid game." Elliot said nothing. He reached to take back the paper. The boy crumpled it and tossed it to the floor. Laughter rippled across the room. That evening, Frank found his son crouched over the trash can, smoothing the paper, tracing the faint lines of knights and pawns. "Does it hurt, son?" Frank asked softly. Elliot shook his head, but tears stained the paper. "I don't mind losing on the board, Dad, but I don't know how to win out here." Frank gathered him close, his own heart breaking. "Out here, winning doesn't mean checkmate. It means staying gentle when the world wants you hard. That's the bravest move you can make. But cruelty has a way of sharpening its teeth when ignored." A week later, Elliot's travel board was found shattered in the schoolyard, its pawns scattered like bones. No one admitted guilt. No one offered comfort. Joseph Klein, when told, closed his eyes as if in pain. "The boy is being hunted," he murmured. "Not for what he has done, but for what he represents." "What do you mean?" Frank asked. Joseph's gaze was distant, haunted. "I was once hunted too, for refusing to lose when the powerful demanded it. The board was my defense. But even boards can be broken." He placed a trembling hand on Frank's arm. "Protect him. He carries light too fragile for envy's claws." The breaking point came one cold Saturday evening. Hunter Blackwell, the Wall Street tycoon who had first underestimated Elliot, had arranged a grand charity gala in Midtown Manhattan. The invitation bore gilt letters, promising an exhibition of genius. Frank hesitated. "We don't owe them performance," he said. But Joseph's whisper cut through the doubt. "Sometimes the only way to silence envy is to face it. Let the boy show truth again." And so they went. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, with gowns and tuxedos, with laughter laced in money. At the center stood a single board upon a stage, pieces gleaming under the light. Elliot was led forward, his small frame swallowed by the vastness of the room. Blackwell himself greeted him with a smile polished for cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, Tonight you shall witness the future. The child prodigy against seasoned masters of finance. A demonstration that brilliance knows no age. Applause swelled. Cameras flashed. One by one, executives took turns against Elliot. They played aggressively, fueled less by strategy than by pride. And one by one, he dismantled them, calmly, swiftly, his hands moving with a grace that seemed older than his years. But then came the final game. Not against an executive, against Blackwell himself. The opening was sharp. Sicilian defense, the battlefield of the ambitious. Elliot played confidently, pushing pawns like soldiers advancing into fire. Blackwell responded with speed, his years of study resurfacing, his pride demanding dominance. The room grew hushed. Even the waiters froze, trays trembling in their hands. By move 20, the position blazed with complexity. Knights tangled, bishops raked across diagonals, queens hovered like vultures. The air was electric with tension. But then Elliot faltered, not in calculation, in spirit. The laughter from school, the broken board in the yard, the cruel headlines all pressed on him at once. His small hands trembled. He hesitated. The clock ticked. Blackwell seized the moment, slamming his rook down with triumph. "Check!" The audience gasped. For the first time, the prodigy was on the brink of defeat. Frank rose from his seat, his heart hammering. He wanted to rush forward, to lift his son from the table, to shield him from the glare of eyes. But Joseph caught his sleeve. "Wait," the old man whispered, his voice like cracked glass. This is his breaking point. He must find his move. On the stage, Elliot sat frozen. His eyes darted across the board, then closed. He remembered Joseph's words. When time runs short, trust the simplest truth. His breathing steadied. He opened his eyes. And then, with a hand no longer trembling, he slid his bishop across the board. A pin. Silent, devastating. Blackwell's rook, once triumphant, was trapped. The audience gasped again, this time in awe. Elliot pressed the attack, his moves now fluid, inevitable. Within 10 turns, Blackwell's king was cornered. "Checkmate," Elliot whispered. The ballroom erupted. Some applauded, some shook their heads in disbelief, but all felt the weight of what they had seen. Back in the dressing room, away from the glare, Elliot slumped into Frank's arms, exhausted. "Dad," he murmured. "I thought I would break." Frank held him close. "You did. But sometimes breaking is how the light gets in." Joseph stepped forward, his eyes glistening. "Tonight you learned the truth of endurance. Brilliance dazzles, but resilience endures. And you, little one, now have both." Elliot closed his eyes, his face buried against his father's chest. The storm had not ended. Envy, cruelty, doubt would rise again. But tonight, in the heart of the storm, he had discovered his own unbreakable core. A breaking point is not the end. It is the place where a new line is drawn, where what was fragile becomes tempered. And so, on that glittering night in Manhattan, the janitor's son, no longer invisible, no longer merely a curiosity, became something else entirely. He became a force that could not be silenced. In chess, the endgame strips the board bare. Gone are the glittering queens and the charging armies. What remains are pawns, kings, and the quiet truth of position. Pride, too, faces its endgame. When all grandeur is spent, what remains of a man is not his victories, but what he does with defeat. The gala match had left Hunter Blackwell shaken. In the glare of chandeliers, he had smiled, laughed, even applauded the boy who cornered his king. But when the guests departed, When the clink of champagne glasses faded, he sat alone in the ballroom, the board still set before him. The bishop's pin still gleamed like a wound. He poured a drink but did not touch it. For the first time in years, the master of money, the predator of Wall Street, felt the sting of humility. And beneath it, something stranger, relief. For weeks, he watched from afar. Elliot Ray's name filled headlines, but Blackwell saw the toll. The pale face of a boy too young to carry so much weight, the protective figure of Frank shielding him from wolves in suits. He saw envy sharpening its knives, whispers growing crueler. It stirred something Blackwell thought long dead. Conscience. One morning, he summoned his board of directors. They expected a speech about quarterly returns, new acquisitions, the machinery of profit. Instead, he spoke of a child. A janitor's son, he said, 6 years old, and in him, I saw more truth than I've seen in any of you. The room stiffened, some shifted uncomfortably. Others smirked, thinking it a passing fancy, but Blackwell's voice was steady. We build towers of glass and call ourselves visionaries. That boy built his vision on nothing but silence, loss, and the square of 64. He has already beaten us, because he plays for something we've forgotten. Silence followed, and in that silence, the first crack appeared in the armor of his pride. Meanwhile, Elliot felt the burden deepen. The more he won, the more people doubted. Some praised him as a prodigy, others sneered that he was a fraud. Letters arrived, some filled with admiration, others with venom. Frank did his best to shield him, but the boy saw the truth in his father's weary eyes. One evening, Elliot whispered, "Dad, why do people hate what they don't understand?" Frank sighed. Because it scares them, son. And people would rather destroy what scares them than learn from it. Elliot fingered his worn knight, the one chipped from years of play. Then I'll keep playing, not to win, to remind them there's more than fear. The breaking point came not in a ballroom, but in the boardroom of Blackwell & Co. A group of investors, restless with scandal and stories, demanded Blackwell distance himself from the child. Geniuses burn out, one sneered. Do not tie the firm's reputation to a janitor's fantasy. Another added, it cheapens us, a circus act paraded through our halls. Blackwell listened in silence, his hands folded. Then he rose, tall and unyielding. You think him a circus act? His voice thundered through the glass chamber. He has more discipline in his 6 years than you in your 60. He has taught me what none of you dare admit. That strategy without humility is nothing. Pride without conscience is rot. He slammed his hand on the table, startling them. If Elliot Ray is a circus act, then I am a fool, and I will gladly be a fool, for I would rather stand beside truth than drown in your arrogance. The board fell silent. A few resigned within weeks. Blackwell did not waver. Word spread of his defiance. Reporters called it madness. Rivals called it weakness. But to Elliot and Frank, it was a shield they had not expected. One evening, Blackwell appeared at their basement flat, not in a limousine, but on foot. He carried no entourage, no cameras, only a small wooden box. Inside was a chess set, hand-carved, each piece polished smooth by age. It was my father's, Blackwell said softly. He taught me the game on this board. I lost him young as you lost your mother. I buried this box for years, thinking success would silence the ache. It never did. He placed the box in Elliot's small hands. Take it. Let it be yours now. And forgive me. Not for losing, but for underestimating you. Elliot opened the box, his fingers brushing the worn knight. He looked up, eyes calm, voice quiet. Every game teaches, even the ones we lose. Blackwell's throat tightened. He bowed his head. For the first time in decades, Hunter Blackwell, master of empires, stood not above, but beside. From that night, a strange companionship grew. Blackwell visited Joseph's booth, humbling himself to sit in silence while the old man replayed games from memory. He asked questions, listened, even laughed. The sharpness in his eyes softened, as though defeat had finally opened a window he had long boarded shut. For Elliot, it was not triumph, but balance. To see an enemy become a student, to see pride bend into humility, it planted a seed deeper than victory. But pride is never killed, only tamed. In quiet moments, Blackwell still felt its pull, the urge to conquer, to prove, to rise higher than others. Yet now he faced his own endgame. With wealth and reputation already his, the only victory left was over himself. And as he watched the boy, pale, fragile, brilliant beyond measure, he understood that his last lesson would not come from markets or mergers, but from a child who played not for crowns, but for truth. That winter evening, as snow fell softly outside the tower, Elliot and Blackwell played alone by the fire. The board was nearly bare. Kings, pawns, one knight. The silence was warm, like the hush of a chapel. Blackwell looked across at the boy and said, "You know, in the endgame, kings must step forward. No more hiding." Elliot smiled faintly. "Then step forward, Mr. Blackwell." And he did. In chess, every move is remembered in notation. Neat symbols, tidy letters, a record preserved long after the pieces are returned to their box. But life has no neat notation. Its moves are burned into memory by love, by loss, by the fire of grief. And sometimes, a legacy is born not in triumph, but in ashes. It began on an ordinary night. Frank Ray pushed his mop across the marble floor of Blackwell Tower, humming softly to himself, the tune his wife once sang while folding laundry. Elliot sat nearby on a bench, his magnetic set open, replaying an endgame from Capablanca. Rook and pawn against rook, a lesson in patience. Joseph Klein leaned against his booth, watching, his eyes warm. Even Hunter Blackwell, who now visited often, lingered that evening, his hands clasped behind his back as if guarding the silence. The tower was quiet. Too quiet. The fire began in the service corridor, a spark from an old wire long neglected. By the time anyone smelled smoke, it had already spread through the walls, hungry and merciless. Alarms shrieked, sprinklers hissed. The marble floor turned slick under Frank's boots. "Elliot!" he cried, sweeping his son into his arms. Joseph stumbled forward, cane slipping on wet stone. Blackwell barked orders, ushering executives toward the stairwell. The building that once seemed invincible now groaned like a wounded beast. Flames licked the lower levels. Smoke coiled like serpents. Frank coughed, his lungs burning, but he kept running. Elliot clutched tight. "Dad!" Elliot gasped. "Mr. Joseph! He's behind!" Frank turned. The old doorman had fallen, his cane lost, his frail body too slow against the rushing fire. Without a word, Frank set Elliot down. "Stay with Blackwell," he commanded. Elliot's eyes widened with fear. "Dad, no!" But Frank was already plunging back into the smoke. Time became fragments, a flash of flames. A crash of falling beams, shouts, sirens. Elliot clung to Blackwell's arm, trembling, eyes fixed on the smoke. Minutes stretched like hours. And then, out of the haze, Frank emerged, staggering, Joseph's weight across his shoulders. His face was blackened, his breath ragged, but his eyes locked on his son. "Go," he rasped. "Take him." Blackwell rushed forward, helping Joseph to safety. Elliot reached for his father, tears streaming. But then the ceiling gave way. A thunderous crack, a wall of fire. Frank pushed Elliot forward with his last strength, shielding him with his body. The boy's scream pierced the night as firefighters pulled him away. Hours later, the fire was out. The tower, once proud, stood scarred, its glass skin blackened, its marble cracked. Reporters called it an accident. Engineers called it neglect. But Elliot called it loss. Frank Ray, the janitor, the father who had given everything, was gone. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, a few co-workers. Joseph, leaning heavily on his new cane. Blackwell, silent, a black ribbon pinned to his lapel. Elliot sat before the casket, his small hands gripping his nightpiece. He did not cry, not in front of others, but inside, grief stormed like a game gone horribly wrong, pieces falling, the king cornered, no move left. After the service, Blackwell knelt beside him. "Elliot," he said softly, "your father's sacrifice will not be forgotten." The boy looked up, eyes red but steady. "Then help me remember him, not with money, with learning, with truth." Blackwell's throat tightened. "We will." That night, Joseph came to the basement flat. His hands trembled as he set a battered notebook on the table. Its pages were filled with diagrams, notations, fragments of games long past. "My legacy," he whispered. "Yours now." Elliot opened the notebook, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. Each game was more than moves. It was memory, a story in 64 squares. Joseph placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father gave his life for you. I give you what remains of mine. Carry them. Teach them. That is how legacies live." Elliot nodded, silent tears falling onto the pages. In the weeks that followed, Elliot changed. He still played, still studied, but his laughter was gone. He moved like a boy aged beyond years, his silence deeper, his gaze sharper. At Blackwell Tower, now under repair, he stood on the marble floor where his father had worked, where his father had fallen. "This is where it ends," he whispered, "and where it begins." Blackwell, standing beside him, heard. "What begins?" "A school," Elliot said softly. "For children like me. For sons of janitors, daughters of cooks, kids no one sees. A place where pawns can become more." Blackwell's heart swelled. Pride had once been his kingdom. Now humility was becoming his teacher. He placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder. "Then we will build it. Not on marble, but on memory." The first step was ashes. From the wreck of Blackwell Tower, they salvaged only fragments. A scorched knight, a half-melted rook, a board charred at the edges. Elliot kept them in a small box, not as relics of loss, but as proof of survival. Every night, he opened the box and whispered, "For you, Dad." Then he studied, moving pieces late into the night, each move a prayer, each game a promise. Legacy is not born from triumph alone. It is carved from grief, shaped by sacrifice, pressed into the hands of those still living. And so, in a small basement flat damp with sorrow, Elliot Ray carried forward both his father's love and Joseph's wisdom. He was only 6 years old, but already he understood. Greatness is not in crowns, but in what one leaves behind. In chess, pawns are underestimated. They shuffle forward, one square at a time, humble and expendable. Yet given patience, protection, and courage, a pawn may walk the length of the board and transform. For Elliot Ray, Janitor's son, 6 years old, carrying grief heavier than his small frame, the time had come to transform his father's sacrifice into a legacy no fire could burn. Winter receded. Snow melted into the gutters of the Bronx. The blackened husk of Blackwell Tower stood shrouded in scaffolding, its marble floors forever scarred. But in a modest community hall down the street, something new was being built. The sign above the door read, "The School of Pawns." It was not large. The paint peeled in places, the ceiling leaked when it rained. Yet inside, rows of mismatched tables held boards donated from every corner of the city. Plastic sets from thrift shops sat beside elegant wooden ones. In the center of the room stood a single charred board, its squares blackened by flame. Elliot had placed it there himself. "So we never forget," he whispered. Frank Ray's memory lingered in every corner. His mop leaned against the wall like a sentinel. His old toolbox sat near the door, still filled with wrenches and tape. Elliot insisted nothing be thrown away. "He built this with his hands," he said. "Now we build with ours." The first students trickled in hesitantly. Sons of janitors, daughters of cafeteria workers, children who had never been noticed except when sweeping crumbs or carrying bags. Their shoes were worn, their hands calloused, but their eyes widened when they saw the boards. Elliot greeted each one, solemn yet kind. "Here, you are not small. Here, you are pieces with power." Joseph Klein sat by the window, watching, his trembling hands steady when they touched the board. Though speech had long abandoned him, his presence spoke volumes. He guided with nods, with eyes, with the occasional whispered word scraped from the ruins of his voice. And Hunter Blackwell, once a man of marble pride, sat quietly in the back, funding supplies, repairing chairs, pouring coffee for parents who never thought a billionaire would serve them. When asked why, he only said, "Because once I thought pawns were nothing. I was wrong." Lessons began simply. How pawns moved, how knights leapt, how bishops carved diagonals like beams of light through stained glass. Elliot explained with the patience of someone far older than his years, but his teaching went deeper than rules. "When your pawn steps forward," he told them, "it is saying, 'I may be small, but I will not stand still.'" When a child lost a piece and pouted, Elliot smiled gently. Loss is not the end. Every piece that falls teaches you where not to step again. And when a game ended in stalemate, he placed his hand on the board. Sometimes no one wins, and that's all right. A draw means we both learned. Word spread. Within months, the hall was full. Children from every borough came, carrying backpacks with holes, shoes with broken laces, eyes hungry for more than food. Volunteers arrived too. Retired teachers, weary parents, even former opponents who had once doubted Elliot's brilliance. The School of Pawns became a place where silence turned into strategy, where grief became guidance, where even the smallest hands could hold power over 64 squares. Yet Elliot remained a child. After lessons, he played in the courtyard with a stick for a sword, laughing with the other children. At night, he still clutched the chipped knight in his pocket, whispering to his father, "We're still moving forward." Sometimes, grief returned like a storm, sudden, fierce. He would wake at night calling for Frank. Joseph would sit beside him, hand on his shoulder, eyes wet with the pain of his own long-lost battles. But always, the dawn came, and with it, the board, waiting patiently for the next move. One spring afternoon, Blackwell brought a group of visiting investors to see the school. They entered expecting a charity project. They left silent, humbled, having watched children who once cleaned hallways now hold kings in their hands. "Why call it the School of Pawns?" one asked Elliot. The boy looked up, his voice calm. "Because pawns are like us, small, forgotten. But if they keep walking, they can become anything." The investor swallowed hard, unable to speak. The years ahead would not be easy. Elliot knew that. The world was vast, cruel, unpredictable. But he also knew something deeper, that even in ashes, legacy could bloom. One evening, as the hall emptied, Elliot sat alone at the charred board, the knight in his hand. He imagined his father beside him, tired but smiling, mop in one hand, pointing with the other. "Did I do right, Dad?" he whispered. The silence was warm, like a hand resting on his shoulder. In his heart, he heard the answer. "Yes, son. Every step forward is ours together." And so the boy who had once been underestimated for being small, poor, invisible, became not just a prodigy, not just a champion, but a teacher. His father's sacrifice, Joseph's wisdom, Blackwell's humbled pride, all wove together into a single legacy, a place where pawns learned they could cross the board. In chess, the final notation is always 1-0 or 0-1, win or loss. But in life, Elliot discovered, the truest ending is not a result. It is a beginning. And in that modest hall, under flickering lights, the janitor's son began a story that would outlast marble, money, and even time itself. The story of pawns who walked forward,